For decades, the world has agreed on a single version of Princess Diana. It is a story so familiar that it now feels unquestionable. A shy 19-year-old girl steps into the most powerful royal family on earth. She is gentle. She is unprepared. She is overwhelmed by tradition, protocol, and a husband who never truly loved her. She is betrayed. She is hurt. She is abandoned. And in the end, she becomes something larger than the institution that failed her. The people's princess. This version of Diana is comforting. It offers a clear victim and a clear villain. It asks us to feel sympathy, not curiosity. Emotion, not examination. And for many years, that was enough. The image has been repeated endlessly. Diana smiling nervously at her wedding. Diana touching the sick. Diana bowing her head beneath the weight of an uncaring system. A young woman crushed by a palace built on silence. But history, especially royal history, is rarely that simple. Because when a story becomes universally accepted, something important is usually missing. Diana has been remembered as powerless, as someone to whom things happened. A figure swept along by forces larger than herself, tradition, duty, cold-blooded protocol. Yet even at the height of her vulnerability, Diana was never invisible. She was never unheard. And she was never without influence. The palace understood this, even if the public did not. From the very beginning, Diana was different from the women who came before her. She did not blend into the background. She did not disappear behind formality. She connected. She looked people in the eye. She made herself emotionally available in a family that had been trained for generations to do the opposite. That quality made her beloved. But it also gave her something far more powerful than sympathy. It gave her attention. And attention, in the modern monarchy, is not weakness. It is leverage. For years, the prevailing narrative has insisted that Diana was naive, too innocent to understand the machinery surrounding her, that she was overwhelmed by the media, consumed by the pressure, and trapped by forces she could neither predict nor control. But innocence and inexperience are not the same thing. Diana entered the royal family young, yes, but she learned quickly, she watched, she adapted. And as the years passed, she began to understand something fundamental, something the palace had always known. In a monarchy built on restraint and silence, emotion could become a form of power. This is not a story about guilt. It is not a story about blame. It is a story about complexity, about how history prefers clean narratives, even when real lives are anything but, about how we often turn human beings into symbols and forget that symbols still make choices. Before Diana became an icon, she was a participant. Before she became a victim in history's memory, she was a woman navigating her circumstances in the only ways she believed were available to her. And that is where the story becomes more uncomfortable. Because once we move beyond the version of Diana we were taught to believe, we are forced to ask a harder question. Not whether Diana was innocent, but whether she was ever truly powerless. To understand why the story of Princess Diana is more complex than we were taught, we must first let go of a comforting assumption: that Diana was powerless. Powerlessness suggests helplessness, a lack of agency, a lack of awareness, a lack of choice. But Diana's life, even at its most painful moments, does not fit that definition. She was constrained. She was emotionally isolated. She was deeply unhappy. But she was not without influence. From early on, Diana demonstrated something that set her apart inside the royal household: an instinctive understanding of attention. Not status, not protocol. Attention. In a family trained to avoid emotional exposure, Diana did the opposite. She leaned into it. She spoke with warmth where others spoke with distance. She touched hands when others kept space. She smiled, not as a formality, but as connection. To the public, this felt natural. To the palace, it felt dangerous. Because the modern monarchy does not run on affection alone. It runs on control, of image, of message, of silence. And Diana was learning, very quickly, how visible she truly was. This was not something she was taught. It was something she discovered. Every appearance brought a reaction. Every gesture produced a headline. Every moment of vulnerability created loyalty. Diana noticed that when she appeared uncomfortable, the public leaned closer. When she appeared warm, the public responded with devotion. And when she withdrew, the silence around her became louder than any statement. This awareness did not make her calculating in a cold sense, but it did make her perceptive. She understood that in a system where she held no constitutional power, visibility itself could shift the balance. That realization changes how we should read the years that followed. Because Diana's most famous moments were not accidents. They were choices made within limitation. When the marriage began to collapse, Diana faced a decision that every royal woman before her had faced in some form: disappear quietly or remain present. History often frames this as though Diana had no option at all, as though the media forced itself upon her, dragging her unwillingly into the spotlight. But the truth is more subtle. Diana did not always avoid attention. She did not always retreat from cameras, and she did not always leave her story to be told by others. She began to understand timing, when to be seen, when to remain silent, when absence would speak louder than presence. These were not the instincts of someone unaware of her position. They were the instincts of someone adapting to it. It is important to say this carefully. Acknowledging Diana's agency does not erase her suffering. Two things can be true at the same time. She could be emotionally wounded and strategically aware. She could be vulnerable and influential. She could be trapped in a system and still learn how to move within it. The palace understood this duality, even if it never admitted it publicly. Behind closed doors, Diana was no longer viewed simply as a fragile young woman in need of protection. She was increasingly seen as unpredictable, not because she was reckless, but because she did not conform to the expected pattern of quiet endurance. Previous generations had absorbed pain privately. Diana expressed it publicly, and that difference mattered. The more Diana connected with the public, the less she depended on institutional approval. The less she depended on institutional approval, the more independent her image became. This is where the idea of innocence becomes misleading. Innocence suggests ignorance. But Diana was not ignorant of what her presence meant. She saw the crowds grow. She saw the headlines follow. She saw how her emotional openness filled a space the monarchy had long kept closed. And once she understood that, she could not unlearn it. This does not mean Diana set out to dismantle the system, but it does mean she was no longer merely enduring it. She was interacting with it, reacting, responding, sometimes resisting, and sometimes, whether intentionally or not, challenging its authority. The monarchy relies on predictability. Diana became unpredictable, not because she was careless, but because she was human in a place designed to suppress visible humanity. This is why describing Diana solely as innocent does her a disservice. It reduces her to a passive figure in her own life story. It removes her intelligence, her adaptability, and her awareness. And perhaps most importantly, it avoids a more difficult truth. That Diana, once she recognized her influence, chose not to surrender it. Those choices would later carry consequences, some empowering, some devastating. But at this point in the story, one thing is already clear. Diana was not simply carried by events. She was learning how to shape them. By the mid-1990s, one belief had become almost sacred: that Princess Diana was hunted relentlessly by the press, that she was chased, cornered, and consumed by a media machine she never invited. This image is powerful, it is emotional, and it is only partially true. There is no question that the British press was aggressive. The tabloids of the 1990s operated with few ethical restraints. Cameras were intrusive, headlines were cruel, privacy was treated as optional. Diana suffered under that pressure, but suffering does not automatically mean passivity. What is often left out of the story is that Diana's relationship with the media was not one-directional. It was not simply pursuit. It was interaction. As Diana's marriage deteriorated and her position within the palace weakened, she faced a familiar problem, one shared by many women who lose institutional protection. Who gets to tell the story? For generations, the palace had answered that question decisively. It told the story itself, selectively, sparingly, and always in service of stability. Diana did not control that machinery, but she began to understand how to bypass it. This is where the popular narrative becomes uncomfortable, because Diana was not always avoiding the press. At times, she engaged it, not openly, not recklessly, but selectively. She learned which journalists listened, which publications would shape her words gently, which moments would resonate emotionally rather than politically. This does not mean Diana invented stories. It means she recognized that silence was no longer neutral. When she remained silent, others spoke for her. When others spoke for her, the narrative hardened against her. So she began to speak, indirectly, strategically, carefully. The press did not simply discover Diana's pain. It was allowed to see it, and there is a difference. This distinction is rarely discussed because it disrupts a clean moral division. It complicates the idea of Diana as purely hunted prey. But history becomes more honest when we acknowledge that Diana was not just reacting. She was navigating. She understood that emotion traveled faster than official statements. That vulnerability reached audiences palace communiques never could. That once the public felt personally connected to her, the institution would hesitate to move against her. This awareness did not make her manipulative in the way critics sometimes suggest. It made her realistic. In a media age, visibility is a form of protection. Diana learned this lesson not from strategy meetings, but from experience. Each photograph reinforced it. Each sympathetic headline confirmed it. Each surge of public support reminded her that she was not alone, even when the palace felt distant. This is where the relationship between Diana and the media became symbiotic. The press needed Diana. She sold papers. She humanized a rigid institution. But Diana also needed the press. It amplified her voice when internal channels closed. It validated her emotional reality when official narratives dismissed it. And crucially, it reminded the palace that public opinion no longer belonged exclusively to them. This mutual dependence does not erase the harm caused by media intrusion, but it reframes the dynamic. Diana was not simply being followed. She was being watched and understood the consequences of being seen. This becomes especially clear when we examine timing. Certain moments of visibility arrived precisely when Diana's position felt most precarious. Appearances that redirected sympathy, stories that softened criticism, silences that invited speculation in her favor. None of this required cynicism, only awareness, and Diana had become acutely aware. The tragedy is not that Diana engaged the media. The tragedy is that once she did, there was no safe way to disengage. Visibility, once embraced, demands continuity. The public expects access. The press expects material. And the line between being heard and being consumed becomes dangerously thin. Diana crossed that line gradually, not recklessly, but inevitably. What began as a way to protect herself emotionally became a permanent state of exposure. And the very tool that gave her voice also eroded her privacy. This is where history often stops asking questions. It prefers the image of Diana as endlessly pursued because it preserves innocence. It keeps her blameless and the system simple. But the truth is more human. Diana was not naive about the media. She was learning to survive within it. She did not create the machine, but she learned how to move inside it, and in doing so, became inseparable from it. That does not make her less sympathetic. It makes her more real, and it brings us to the most difficult part of the story. Because once Diana chose to engage publicly, the conflict was no longer just between her and the palace. It was between two systems of power, one built on tradition and silence, the other on emotion and visibility. And Diana stood directly between them. By the time the world watched Princess Diana speak openly about her marriage, the conflict had already shifted. This was no longer a private struggle between a woman and an unhappy relationship. It had become a confrontation between an individual and an institution. The monarchy had always functioned on a simple principle: endure quietly, and the system will protect you. Diana did not follow that rule. It is important to understand that she was not the first royal to suffer in silence. Others before her had endured isolation, infidelity, and emotional distance. They had learned to survive by disappearing into the background. Diana chose a different path, not because she misunderstood the rules, but because she believed those rules were no longer protecting her. From Diana's perspective, silence had failed. Private channels led nowhere. Internal conversations changed nothing. And loyalty, as she experienced it, flowed upward toward the institution, not outward toward the individual. So she did what the monarchy feared most. She made the private public. This decision is often framed as reckless, a moment of emotional collapse rather than conscious choice. But that interpretation ignores the pattern that came before it. By the mid-1990s, Diana had already learned how public visibility altered the balance of power. She had seen how sympathy shielded her from outright dismissal. She had felt how public affection constrained the palace's response. Speaking publicly was not an impulse. It was an escalation. And escalation always carries consequences. From the palace's point of view, Diana had crossed an invisible line. She had broken the unspoken contract that sustained the monarchy. Problems stay inside. Dignity stays intact. But from Diana's point of view, that contract had already been broken. She believed she had upheld her side, loyalty, discretion, patience, and received isolation in return. This is where the moral question becomes uncomfortable. Was Diana justified? Or was she undermining the very system that gave her platform and protection? The answer depends entirely on where one stands. To the monarchy, Diana's openness threatened stability. It introduced uncertainty. It made the crown appear divided, human, fallible. To Diana, stability without compassion felt hollow. She did not seek to destroy the institution, but she was no longer willing to disappear inside it. In choosing to confront the system publicly, Diana accepted a dangerous trade. She gained control of her narrative, but lost the protection of silence. Once she spoke openly, there was no return to anonymity. Every action would be scrutinized. Every relationship would be analyzed. Every movement would be interpreted. The system responded as systems often do when challenged, not with anger, but with distance. Support became conditional. Protection became selective. The message was subtle but clear. Independence came at a cost. Diana had won the public, but she had lost the insulation that tradition once provided. And this is where the tragedy deepens. Because systems are patient. They do not need to defeat individuals quickly. They simply wait. Over time, the emotional labor of constant visibility wears thin. The line between empowerment and exposure blurs, and the freedom gained through openness begins to feel fragile. Diana's choice to fight the system publicly was neither purely brave nor purely reckless. It was human. It reflected a woman who felt unheard and refused to remain invisible. But it also placed her in a position where every mistake would be amplified and every misstep remembered. History often frames this confrontation as a battle with clear sides: the palace versus Diana, cold tradition versus warm humanity. But reality is less satisfying. Diana did not win the fight, and the system did not truly lose. Instead, both were changed, in ways neither fully anticipated. The monarchy learned that silence could no longer guarantee control. Diana learned that visibility could not guarantee safety, and once that lesson was learned, it could not be undone. All that remained was the final question. After everything Diana had endured, after everything she had challenged, one decision still lay ahead: not how to be seen, but how to live outside the system she had confronted. By the end of her life, Princess Diana had become something no one inside the palace could fully control, and no one outside it could truly protect. History often asks us to choose a single interpretation: hero or victim, rebel or innocent. But Diana does not fit comfortably into any of these categories. She was not innocent in the way legends require. She understood attention. She recognized influence. She made choices, sometimes carefully, sometimes emotionally, within a system that left her few safe options. Yet none of this erases the tragedy of her story, because awareness does not equal safety, and agency does not guarantee protection. Diana learned how to be seen, but not how to disappear. Once she stepped beyond the boundaries of the monarchy, the rules changed again. There was no longer a palace buffer, no institution to absorb the pressure, no agreed limits between private life and public demand. The very public that adored her also expected constant access. The same visibility that once felt empowering became relentless. Diana had won sympathy, but lost shelter. This is the quiet irony at the heart of her legacy. She challenged a system built on silence and survived it. But she entered a world built on exposure, and it offered no refuge. In remembering Diana, history has softened her edges. It has protected her image by simplifying her story. It has turned complexity into comfort. The innocent princess, the betrayed wife, the tragic icon. These versions allow us to mourn without questioning, to sympathize without examining. But Diana was more than a symbol. She was intelligent, perceptive, emotionally intuitive, and sometimes impulsive. She navigated power without formal authority. She understood human connection better than protocol. And like many people placed under extraordinary pressure, she made decisions that carried consequences she could not fully control. This does not diminish her compassion. It does not negate her kindness. And it does not excuse the failures of the system that isolated her. It simply restores her humanity. Perhaps the most honest way to remember Diana is not as a flawless victim, nor as a calculating figure, but as a woman navigating impossible circumstances with imperfect tools. She was neither naive nor manipulative, neither powerless nor protected. She was complex, and complexity, more than innocence, is what makes her story endure. Because when history stops asking whether Diana was innocent and starts asking whether she was human, the story becomes far more meaningful. Not a fairy tale, not a cautionary tale, but a reminder that even icons make choices, and that those choices in unforgiving systems can carry a heavy price.